Hello, Indy Reformed. This is the video for week 6, day 4. So we are coming close to the end of the first week of looking at worship in the Christian life. And today we are looking at the idea of worship as dialogue. Worship as dialogue. Now, what exactly does this mean when we say this? Well, simply put, worship is a discussion between God and his people. One of my former professors, Dennis Johnson, put it this way. When we come to worship on the Lord's Day, we are not coming to a memorial, but to a meeting. Basically, when God's people gather on his day and come into his presence, there is a discussion that takes place. There's a conversation going on. God meets with his people and calls us to worship him. So when we gather as a church on the Lord's Day, we hear and receive from God through his word and sacraments, and we respond to him in things like prayer and song, offerings, and so on. When we gather as the people of God, it is not we who are initiating things. God is the one who begins things. He's the one who calls us. This is the pattern that we see throughout Scripture. It's a pattern of the covenant of grace, that God initiates and his people respond. God calls and his people answer. We can think of passages like Psalm 18, where we see this pattern quite clearly. We read in verse 1, "I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies." The psalmist then goes on to talk about God's redemption, God's grace to him and to his people. And then in verse 49, we read these words, "For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing to your name." So we hear that God is acting and his people are responding, in this case the psalmist. That's the pattern that we see throughout the Bible. This is the kind of thing that the churches in the Reformation were trying to get across in their worship services. We read the words of the reformer Martin Luther, who once said, "Worship is at once a dialogue and an act of praise." The event which we call worship consists simply in this, that our well-beloved Lord himself speaks to us by his holy word, and we, for our part, speak to him by our prayers and our hymns of praise. So we see here a pattern. God redeems, and his people worship him as a result. This is the guilt, grace, and gratitude thing that we saw earlier. God calls, and his people respond to him. This is something that's not just true on the Lord's Day. It's true in all of life, but it's especially true when we gather together as God's people. As we'll see in the coming weeks when we talk about liturgy, God calls us to his worship, and we respond to him. Too often the emphasis is on what we do in worship. The biblical pattern which the Reformed churches have historically recognized is that God is the primary actor. He's the one who does the most here. He's the one who strengthens, sustains, and spiritually feeds his people through his word and sacraments, and we are those who respond. So if God did not initiate, there would be no people of God to worship him. If God did not call us in worship, there would be no response of praise. So this is what we mean by the dialogue of worship.